This is NatSec Matters.
I'm host Michael Allen with Beacon Global Strategies. Today I'm joined by Mr. Craig Singleton, Senior Director for China and Senior Fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Before joining that foundation, he spent more than a decade serving in a series of sensitive national security roles within the U.S. government, where he primarily focused on East Asia. Mr. Singleton is a recognized thought leader, frequently contributing to top-tier outlets such as the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Foreign Policy. Mr. Singleton joins us today to discuss his recent article titled "Trump and Xi Are in a Tariff Trap," where he sheds light on President Trump's escalating trade war with the People's Republic of China and the geopolitical implications of China's retaliation measures. Stay with us as we speak to Craig Singleton. Craig, welcome to NatSec Matters.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, you've been a leader in your government career and of late as a profound commentator on U.S.-China dynamics, especially as it pertains to trade relations with China. So you're the perfect guest for us to have on to try and make sense of what's happening in the tariff war. In your recent foreign policy article, you argue that Trump and Xi are in a full-scale tariff spiral. Can you elaborate on what that means and what are the core dynamics that are driving this spiral?
Yeah, I mean, this is the heart of the issue. We're in a spiral because both leaders are convinced the other side will crack first. You know, President Trump sees pressure not as a tactic, but as the strategy itself. And he views these tariffs, now over 100% on a lot of Chinese goods, not as a bargaining chip per se, but I think as the main weapon to force Beijing's capitulation. And so from his perspective, if tariffs make Chinese imports unaffordable, that's exactly the point. Either China folds or it bleeds market share in the U.S. And Trump believes this is working. And when China publicly called recently further hikes something like a joke, he probably saw that as validation, proof that China hit the wall first. And I think that reinforces his belief that there's no need to engage. He has openly teased that he's waiting for Xi to call him, but privately he feels very comfortable with the standoff. He reads every day without a Chinese concession as a reason to keep escalating. And he also sees a political upside. You know, the short-term pain of higher prices or market volatility, I think, feed his image as a tough negotiator. And he's betting that U.S. businesses will either adapt or even lobby Beijing to make concessions. And so he sort of sees relentless pressure paired with side deals with other countries as a means to force Beijing to blink. But I think you got to take the flip side too. Mm-hmm. And, Xi Jinping views today's tariffs as already beyond prohibitive, right? Raising them further from Beijing's perspective changes little economically, but politically, Xi Jinping has no choice but to resist. His nationalistic base and personal authority demand it, right? So in his mind, there's really this perception gap, and it's dangerous. Trump believes time is his ally and China's playbook is running it out, and Xi believes his system can endure the pain longer and that Trump's political clock will force a shift. And I think that's the hint to the spiral there. That's sort of the crux of it.
So you say Trump's pressure is the name of the game and he's looking for China to capitulate. I mean, exactly capitulate on what? Is it that they reduce their tariffs, that they make structural changes in their economy? Like, what does Trump want?
He wants everything. I mean, I think it's been pretty clear that Trump's view is that the world and global trading system as a whole needs to change. And he believes that he has a mandate to reorient global trade maps in ways that are advantageous to the United States, that finally, in his view, call out China's non-market practices and just reshape global trading systems and networks. And so I suspect what he believes will happen is in the next 90 days or so, he will negotiate dozens of bespoke bilateral trade agreements with lots of countries around the world that will lower trade barriers for the United States, He will claim many of these as a win, and I suspect it's possible markets will rally. And then he's going to direct all of his effort against China, which has been highly resistant to making any changes to its economy, structurally, fiscally. And I think what we're going to see is a shift not just from trade war to financial decoupling and technological decoupling. And it's going to accelerate at a pace that I think all of us will find pretty frenetic.
So we're at 145% tariffs on China now. You think Trump wants to keep that on more or less indefinitely until the Chinese come to us and say, what do you need in order to reduce those tariffs?
I mean, I think at this point, the president probably assesses that he still has room to run. The Chinese have signaled that they don't really intend to increase tariff much further. They don't see a point to it. But again, from Trump's perspective, he can keep going higher. And he can also employ a lot of these non-tariff measures to continue to push back against the Chinese. And I think that's ultimately where this president is probably likely to go, and where I suspect the Chinese will intensify the non-market retaliatory practices that they've already engaged in. But it seems unlikely that they're going to have some new toolkit there, sort of new tools in the toolkit, if you will.
Yeah.
But Trump can actually expand into financial decoupling, whether it's delisting Chinese stocks or cutting out outbound investment. And I think that the president and the administration assesses that they actually have lots of new tools that they can put into play and bring to bear against the Chinese. And the Chinese actually don't have that many tools to play or any cards to play here. And I think that miscalculation, whether correct or otherwise, is sort of why things will probably get worse before they maybe get better.
So I want to get to the strategy vis-a-vis China and the European Union in just a second. But let me ask, it feels like China does have a bunch of things they can retaliate on. I know they were restricting the export of critical minerals during the Biden administration, but they seem to have stepped it up recently. It feels like they've already identified the things that we need the most from China, and it feels like they're beginning to restrict the exports of those goods or minerals or whatever the case may be. How is China going to retaliate? And that's not great for us either, is it?
I mean, they have cards to play. I think the United States probably has more. The headline is the tariff retaliation, with Beijing matching our triple-digit tariffs. And we are seeing a shift now to non-tariff weapons from China, right? Export controls on rare earths, targeted restrictions on critical components, pressure on U.S. firms operating inside of China. They've also signaled that they could slow roll regulatory approval and potentially even weaponize maritime choke points. Importantly, though, Beijing knows these moves have limits. They've used rare earth threats before. And I think in this case, Washington has learned not to panic. And so much about resolving today's issue and signaling resolve on their end to a domestic audience is about applying real pain to the United States. But I would say that the pain points are highly uneven. In sectors like consumer electronics, the tariffs from China, all of that definitely stings. But a lot of companies have been diversifying supply chains. And I think the real risk is in industrial components and things like magnets and batteries and EV supplies, where China still dominates upstream production for sure. And that's where the tariffs plus China's export controls create a lot of dual pressure on us. But on the flip side, U.S. producers of critical materials and rare earth miners and domestic advanced manufacturing, they potentially stand to benefit, I think, at least in the medium term. And so Washington is actively looking to accelerate incentives there. So it's a squeeze, but it's also a spark for certain sectors to grow in the United States.
Yeah, that's great. I've heard so often that that's part of what we need. So he's trying to force some decoupling in critical areas, right?
I think he's thinking about strategic decoupling now, and it's trade. And we're seeing the shift now to financial markets, and the Treasury Secretary's remarks about, again, like potentially delisting Chinese firms from U.S. exchanges. We've all heard for years talk of enhancements to outbound investment screening and flows. And the tech decoupling has been happening for some time. I think all of these things start to accelerate and become self-reinforcing in a way that is just dramatically different than perhaps the strategy that the Biden administration pursued.
Okay, great. That's fascinating. All right, so I've heard for months, even before the election, that if Trump were to win, what we ought to do is make common cause with the European Union on whatever our issues are with them first, and then jointly approach the Chinese on whatever our issues are, from structural changes to tariffs to non-tariff barriers or whatever. What happened to that idea? Is that just not in the cards? Does it not make sense to Team Trump?
I actually think that Team Trump would argue that's exactly what they're doing. And the substance is there, if maybe the style is a little flawed. I suspect that nearly every European country is in active negotiations with this administration to lower trade barriers and to get some sort of a deal. And that those bespoke trade deals, the new bilateral arrangements, those are going to be announced in the next 60 to 90 days. Markets will rally. Trump will say, I've created all these reduced all these trade barriers. Look at everything I'm doing. And then in his mind, he would seek to then rally this new grouping of partners and say, well, the only country that's not playing ball with any of us is China. And look what they're doing, dumping on your markets. Why don't we all rally cause and go against them? The question is whether, after being punched in the face, will these European partners or even some of our Asian allies be inclined to sort of get into a high stakes gamble like that with the Chinese? And I think that's where a lot of work needs to be done on bringing those European partners on side, explaining to them what the strategy is here, what are the desired end states. And I think because this trade war has accelerated a lot faster than many of us predicted, not all of that intellectual scaffolding has been sort of laid out there for the public to digest.
So it feels like that would come later. I kind of thought that Trump was going to hold out a little bit longer than he did. I mean, I understand the articles about the bond markets and the rest, but I kind of thought that by the week that we're in now, he would have been rolling out agreements first with the Japanese and then South Korea and India and even Israel and the UK. Do you think that is their plan from here on out? They're going to start rolling out individual deals with other countries, thereby maybe enabling the United States to get back to the geopolitics of it all, which is trying to limit China's influence in Asia and again, back to making common cause with the Europeans eventually?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where we're heading. I sort of see three scenarios, but they all point in the same direction, which is intensified rivalry, right? Scenario one is Trump secures all these side deals with third countries, but keeps the pressure on China. This leaves Beijing isolated and maybe boxed in. Scenario two is China digs in and escalates with a lot of this non-tariff retaliation, rare earths, shipping disruptions, capital controls. Washington treats this not as a deterrent, but as justification to go harder. And scenario three is there's some sort of a tactical pause, but no genuine reset, with the Chinese at least. So even if a deal is cut, I think that distrust runs so deep that decoupling continues under the surface. And so the through line is that no administration, I'd say Trump or otherwise, is likely to restore the old status quo with China or with the Europeans or even our Asian allies. And U.S.-China relations are structurally adversarial now. And so the future is not about restoring balance. It's about managing confrontation. And for business leaders and policymakers, I think that means assuming the U.S.-China divorce is happening and they have to plan accordingly.
Yeah, wow. Okay, so this is in many ways really moving forward with the decoupling that we heard about so often in the first term. But can I ask you, though, so many people think that what Trump is really after in a trade negotiation with the Chinese, and they harken back to the phase 2 or phase 1 trade agreement from the first term, that he's just after purchases, agricultural purchases or energy purchases, and that it was Lighthizer and the other trade lawyers and experts that were deep into forced technology transfer and all the other structural issues in the Chinese economy, if we ever even get to some sort of negotiation with the Chinese, do you think that Trump is going to sort of revert to this is the most important thing I need and I don't need to try and force any structural changes on the Chinese?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think to your point, things are moving a lot faster than a lot of us expected. And I think we're past the debate phase and sort of well into the operational decoupling phase. Sectors like semiconductors or critical minerals, EV batteries, biotech, these are all flashpoints. And I think capital markets are frankly next in line. And Washington and the Trump administration are not hiding this. I mean, policymakers are being pretty explicit that they view decoupling not as a risk, but as an objective, sort of a necessary step to insulate the U.S. economy and force hard choices globally. And I think the president's framing is also explicit: force companies and countries to choose sides. The reality is, I think the deeper the tariff war goes, the more businesses are going to accelerate supply chain shifts, not just for economic reasons, but frankly, because the Trump administration is compelling them to. And so decoupling is no longer this abstract risk. I think it's an active policy goal, and the trade war is the engine driving it.
Got it. All right. Earlier, you mentioned that some of our allies feel like they've been punched in the face, and that may influence their degree of cooperation with us. So, this is a great invitation to just talk about the geopolitical place that we find ourselves in. Before I get to Taiwan and whether we have a Chinese security, if you will, policy, how do we have we misplayed this by tariffing the entire world, seemingly angering them in thereby making them less likely to make common cause with the United States? So that question generally, and then I want to go back to the Europeans in particular, when you consider, in effect, that we're trying to decouple with Europe too.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the style here is having a cascading effect. The tariffs and broader decoupling agenda globally are bleeding into the security sphere. I think they're hardening lines across Asia for allies like Japan or the South Koreans or Australia. I think this is confirmation that the U.S. is serious about shifting supply chains and reshaping global trade flows. But more than that, I do think it's sending an unmistakable message to Beijing that economic leverage will not stop Washington from confronting China in security domains too, whether that's the Taiwan context or South China Sea. And so I think what we're seeing is the trade war is reinforcing, with friends and foes alike, U.S. efforts to create what I'd call a security economic scaffolding across not just the Indo-Pacific, but globally, tightening linkages between supply chain diversification, defense partnerships, and deterrence. And I think that's ultimately where this administration would like to go. I think some of the messaging, though, has been pretty muddled, and that's left our friends and partners just confused about how they can engage constructively. I suspect in the next few months, as these trade deals get announced, that partners will realize that they didn't really have to give up too much to get on the administration's good side. And objectively, it's been a long time coming for everyone to sort of gang up on China and force structural changes there. And whether this administration can build out that coalition or not remains to be seen, but they certainly would seem to have some momentum here if they can land these trade deals, stabilize markets, and start to pull other countries on side.
Okay, so you don't think we've done any permanent damage to a lot of these relationships moving forward that we need, let's call it, from a geopolitical perspective?
I mean, I think we're something like 80, 85 days in. I think it's a little early for us, and I think a lot of things still need to be settled here. I don't think any partners around the world suspected that the Trump administration wouldn't posture tough. And I also suspect that a lot of them recognized that the new administration would push for deals. I mean, so much of what we're seeing today, even though the news cycle makes it feel frenetic, so much of this was telegraphed. Now, partners and friends may or may not like some of the, again, like the messaging and the style and the approach. And it's certainly divergent from prior administrations, even I would say the first Trump term. But increasingly, you're starting to see countries play ball and they want to bargain. And I think there's an effort by this administration to portray the United States as the unavoidable economic partner of choice. And that is going to force some hard decisions in countries that have probably been a long time coming. And I think the administration, the risk here is the administration might be very surprised or startled if some countries decide to hedge on the China side of the equation. And I think that's where some of the risk lies here. And some of the big questioning, of course, will be if our economy can continue to grow, if we can absorb some of these changes, if markets stabilize, there will be a strong contrast between what's happening with China's economy, which is really in free fall. These export controls, the tariffs tripling are going to have a very, very serious and deleterious effect on China's economy. When forced to choose, do these countries sort of hang their hat on the United States, thinking that they can outlive maybe this current administration and they're in it for the long haul, or do they side up against China at a time when China's economy and what China can really offer is diminishing? And I think those hard choices are what face a lot of countries around the world.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with Craig Singleton.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
In addition to being such an expert on all these international economics issues, you're also a real expert on Taiwan, the South China Sea, and the relationship between China and Taiwan. I mean, my sense is that, and I pay attention for a living, I'm not real sure what our China policy is right now. I get what it is on economics and tariffs and the rest, but I haven't seen Donald Trump say much about deterring a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. He definitely had 3 or 4 different answers during the campaign about, they took semiconductor plans from us and they owe us money and it's an insurance policy, but where do you think Trump is on Taiwan and just the politics of deterrence?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is like the $1 trillion question, simply because of the semiconductor supply chain centrality here. I'm just not sure we know yet. They say personnel is policy. We've heard that, you and I, in this town for decades. I think President Trump is the policy, though. And so even though they're still staffing up parts of the administration where some of the Asia policy and China policy would build up, and by and large, I think they have like a really strong team. A lot of seats haven't been filled yet. And I don't think, by and large, China beyond the tariff issue has been a key sort of factor and determinant. And it probably won't be until there is some sort of rapprochement or engagement directly at the leader-to-leader level, which again seems at this stage highly, highly improbable at the moment. I think on Taiwan, this administration sees economic resilience here and abroad as sort of essential to Taiwan's defense. And so some of the tariffs and tech controls on China, I think, are part of a broader play to fortify Taiwan's position, actually. I think it remains to be seen how this will play out, but TSMC and other Taiwanese companies have expressed interest in making serious investments here in the United States. And I think those are goodwill indicators to this administration that Taiwan's both interested in spending more on defense and investing here in the United States.
Yeah.
I think in the South China Sea, though, China has obviously ramped up military signaling, but Beijing's economic troubles may limit, in some respects, its risk appetite. There's a lot of saber rattling, but China's also struggling with a lot of domestic pressures. And I think so far, big parts of the administration see a lot of China's activity as bluster, maybe not a preparation for an imminent conflict. And so I think the bottom line for me is like the trade war is reinforcing U.S. efforts to build this, security economic domain, to really fuse them together. And then through those efforts to be in a stronger long-term position to take on China and ultimately deter any of this adventurism that the Chinese have signaled.
Yeah, that's interesting. How do you factor in this alleged desire by President Trump to want to get along with Xi Jinping? I mean, here we are. We have a massive tariffs against the Chinese, but it seems to be an open secret in Washington that what Trump is interested in when we have the APEC summit, I think in South Korea in the fall, that supposedly Trump wants to go to China after that. So he wants to have great relations with great powers. At the same time, he seems like on his economic agenda to be very aggressive. I mean, how do you factor in this, Trump's understandable desire to have a good rapport with Xi Jinping?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a little bit of mutual miscalculation here, right? Trump sees relentless pressure and flattery as complementary, right? He is convinced that he can, batter Beijing and also, I would say, sort of butter them up by talking positively of Xi Jinping. Yet I think the Chinese read a lot of this as duplicity, proof that Washington can't be trusted, even if talks resume. And it's striking that after years of back and forth negotiations and all these high-level bilateral engagements, neither side truly grasps the other's calculus. And so unless the two sides can create an off-ramp that preserves Xi's authority while satisfying Trump's appetite for triumph, it seems like the current conflict is destined to escalate further, if for no other reason that neither leader wants to step back and neither leader really knows how.
Yeah. It seems like President Trump has, there's this anecdote, and I wonder if you might comment on it, that we've heard many, many times, that when Trump was in office the first time, and people would bring a Taiwan issue to him, sometimes or most often a security issue, he would say, the resolute desk here is China, and the tip of this pen is Taiwan. And I think that was his way of saying he doesn't want the tail to wag the dog here. Do you think fundamentally Trump believes in what a lot of China hawks in Washington believe, which is that if China were to take Taiwan, they would be able to project power not only across the South China Sea, but set themselves up to eventually project power outward from beyond their backyard?
What I am convinced about is that the president doesn't want to be the U.S. leader to lose Taiwan. I take him at his word, and I think there's broad consensus in his administration and even amongst the American electorate that no more wars. And so in his mind, particularly after he won, he signaled quite clearly that he doesn't think Xi Jinping would retake Taiwan on his watch, and that Trump was prepared to go up to 200% or more of tariffs to make it clear that the Chinese should rethink a military invasion. And so on the one hand, do I suspect that the president he clearly understands that Xi Jinping's grand designs on Taiwan are very serious and deeply linked to Xi's historical destiny. But at the same time, he doesn't want to be the U.S. leader that loses the first island chain, recognizing that China's retaking of Taiwan is as much about breaking through the first island chain as it is breaking through the perception that the U.S. has them contained. And I think that linkage and the impact on U.S. alliances and the impact on U.S. reputation may alone be enough to convince Trump and his administration to take pretty serious steps to bolster deterrence, whether it's maybe a little bit less about an art of the deal with China about Taiwan. They are playing a little bit of an art of the delay, and that's to buy time for us and to slow China down. And again, we're 85 days into this. I know it feels longer for all of us, But I think the contours of that general policy seem to be something that this administration and Congress will gravitate towards.
Yeah, I think you're right there. As we begin to wrap up, I mean, I wonder if I can get you to comment a little bit on our relationships in the region. And I think most people sort of assume that, the first tier great relationships that we have in Asia begin with Japan, and of course, Korea's right there. And depending on who's president in the Philippines, it seems like we're back to great relations there. Can you sort of assess the state of U.S. relations with each of these countries today? And are we in good stead, or are they ready to back us against China economically and ultimately on security issues?
It's a good question. I mean, I think we have to recognize that there is a difference between these anchor alliances, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, and what I would probably refer to as these agile alignments that exist throughout Southeast Asia, even parts of Europe, right? So we know that stability is rooted in these anchor alliances, but we're going to need to accept that with a lot of other countries in the region, we're going to need to build out these agile, issue-specific partnerships with non-treaty allies to address lots of other issues like cybersecurity and economic coercion and even military confrontation. And so this evolving collective security approach is going to combine, in an ideal scenario, the strength of these anchor alliances with the flexibility to meet new challenges. And so it's not just about reacting to China. It's about shaping the environment in which we all operate. And I think these are necessary steps. And as cooperation hopefully deepens, I think the hope is that China, North Korea, and Russia start to reconsider the costs of their aggression. But a lot of that will be about relationship and alliance management. At the same time, we accept other countries in the region for who they are. I think one of the greatest challenges being a former U.S. diplomat or operating in this space is sometimes trying to force countries or viewing countries how we want them to behave or what we sort of expect from them that might be divergent from their stated objectives or just historical realities. And if we accept a lot of countries as they are, I think we're actually going to be able to operate deftly in the region to figure out, okay, these anchor alliances are with us on nearly every issue. We have to build out these agile alliances, or agile alignments rather, with these other countries on issue-specific topics. And we just have to accept that not every country is going to be with us on every single issue. And if we can master that, and it's a very different construct than the traditional transatlantic NATO mindset where it's kind of everything and nothing. I think if we can manage that flexibility and do it deftly, we have a real chance to succeed and sort of change the conditions on the ground in East Asia. But it's going to take a lot of work. And it's going to be a project that I think extends well beyond this administration.
Okay, great. Well, before I get to the big question, you've reminded me I haven't asked you about the relationship between China and Russia. Let me just first ask you, what do you think the state of that relationship is? I know on paper it's a, friendship without limits, and that's what they said before the war with Ukraine. But historically, these two countries have a lot of misgivings about each other, some skepticism historically, and people think, I believe falsely, that it's in the cards that we could pull a reverse Kissinger, which is befriend Russia and split them from China. So first, just sort of talk about the relationship between Russia and China, and then if you could sort of assess this reverse Kissinger tactic.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we could call it a bromance of sorts, but it's strong. I think it's a relationship that's rooted more in a mutual loathing of the United States and perhaps less in a shared vision for the world. There's no doubt that I think Xi Jinping sees Vladimir Putin and Russia as a long-term strategic ballast against the United States. But I wonder whether Putin's impatience to dismantle the whole order is destined to collide with Xi's long-term desire to co-opt it, and whether that divergence, how that plays out a little bit. I think in a lot of respects, Xi is trapped. He's powerless to pull Putin back from the brink. I don't think he's demonstrated any inclination that he wants to do that, but he's certainly unwilling to take any steps to finish the job. And so there is tension in this no limits partnership. However, disavowing Putin is a non-starter, and I don't think that's going to occur at all. And that would just represent a complete repudiation of Xi's judgment. It would be seen at home and abroad as a capitulation to Western powers. And I just don't think it's in the cards. Whether we can split them apart, I think there are a lot of questions about whether that's possible. I sort of argue it's better to bind them together. I sort of want, in my mind, ideally as someone who believes in the United States in our project here, that Putin's barbarism becomes sort of synonymous with Xi's brand. And as we force more and more countries to pick and choose and to sort of wake up to economic realities and geopolitical realities and the values divergence between the United States and the sort of growing axis of authoritarians, that countries may have a distaste for this current U.S. administration's sort of style and approach and messaging, but long term they recognize that the threat from Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, is much more serious, and so they make that calculation that way.
Got it. All right, here's the big question. We've talked about, or the country in foreign policy circles has talked about the Davidson window, by which, in theory, China will have built up their military to such a degree that they would be capable of a cross-straits invasion. Now, that's different from the political decision to actually invade Taiwan. But I wonder if you might comment a little bit. What does your gut tell you on whether Xi Jinping wants to make this gamble? Is he going to go and do this? Is he going to try and do a cross-straits invasion, if not this term, then the next? What do you think about this?
I think Xi Jinping is dead serious about China's military building up the capabilities necessary to retake Taiwan by 2027. The political decision about whether to go, no go is, I think, really complex. And I think there's one thing that if we put aside a lot of the rhetoric from China, I think ultimately this is a really risk-averse regime. I think a lot of the bluster masks a lot of vulnerability. I suspect that if they had the military capabilities, and the will to retake Taiwan, they would have already done so, and they haven't. I think the calculus about whether to go, no go is going to be complex. What I don't suspect will happen is that the Chinese just wing it. They risk everything, the CCP's very legitimacy, on a military invasion that could very well go poorly and is just so highly complex. Where I think we have seen real cues from the Chinese is that they believe that there's value in waging political warfare and gray zone warfare against Taiwan, particularly to undermine the current Lai administration and to reduce President Lai to one term in the hopes that he could be replaced in an upcoming election with a party that might be more amenable to Beijing's reunification calls. And so I think the day that President Lai won his election last year, the Chinese released a copy of a secret speech from Xi Jinping. And it was dated to when Nancy Pelosi traveled to Taiwan. And it said in the speech, our goal will be to undermine popular support for the ruling party, to weaponize pluralism, and to make it clear that there are consequences if they want to pursue a path towards independence, and that they're going to use all of their political warfare tools to make that happen. And I think by and large, every indication I've seen is that remains the primary objective, to win without fighting. But that doesn't mean that a war is off the table at all. And it would be a big mistake if we confuse a lot of the current military purges in China's military as an indication that they're not willing to go to war. I think they will. They'll go to war with the military they have, but I think they see a lot of their ways to get what they want.
Can I ask one little thing? I've been meaning to ask someone this. We hear all the time about purges of corrupt generals in the Chinese military. What's the significance of all this? People seem to be reading a lot into it, like, well, they're not ready to mount an invasion. Is that the case, or are people overreading it? How do we interpret that?
I think we're really misreading it. H.R. McMaster has terms like strategic narcissism to describe how we in the United States view a lot of these geopolitical moves. We think a lot of it has to do with us and our mindset and our posturing, or we sort of assume that our adversaries mirror our own thinking about military readiness. And, one thing that I've been trying to do a lot of research on recently is looking back at the Cold War, particularly how Marxist-Leninist regimes view purges. And by and large, there's every indication that Xi Jinping believes that through purges and through constant revolution and constant upheaval, the party can get stronger and better and root out corruption. And this is a hallmark of Marxist-Leninist regimes. And so we as Westerners sort of assess, well, this probably means they don't think they have the military that's capable of going to war. And I think we're starting to see some historical corollaries, though, where Stalin did massive purges of the military for slightly different reasons, but those all preceded land invasions of other countries. And so I think it would be a mistake for us to confuse these purges and these policy and personnel shifts as an indication that that war is off the table because they don't think that they can do it. I think Xi Jinping would probably argue all of these purges and all of this constant indoctrination is necessary to ensure that we can, in fact, go to war. And that's sort of where we sit today.
That's great. I think I agree with you. Craig Singleton, thank you so much for joining us today on NatSec Matters.
Yep, thanks for having me.
You bet. That was Craig Singleton. I'm Michael Allen. Please join us next week for another episode of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.